My name is Spencer Snyder. Welcome to Breaking News. In his coverage of Hurricane Ian in Florida this week, Tucker Carlson pulled out a hallmark of bad faith argumentation, and that is the cry that the other side is politicizing a tragedy. When someone doesn't believe in or doesn't want to accept the actual circumstances of a situation, or they're just trying to shut down debate, you can just say, stop politicizing XYZ.
But first, a step back. So when something this awful happens, something that affects the lives of millions of your fellow Americans, decent people step back for a moment. It's a moment that demands reverence and silence to consider what we've just seen. And then the practical questions. People are suffering. How are they suffering? They don't have power. They don't have communications. How many homes were destroyed? You ask questions like that, and you try to assess what this means and the human cost of it. The one thing you don't do is immediately jump forward to score some sort of cheap and sleazy political point from it. That used to be obvious. But for the past several years, it's been clear it's no longer obvious, at least to one political party. You saw this happen after the forest fires in California.
Okay, so first, this is obviously a cudgel, always used in bad faith, and it's to argue not against the substance of an argument, but of its very existence, right? And it's silly on its face, because anyone as deeply involved in politics as he is should know that everything is political. Everything is affected by decisions made in government buildings or by people in power. How much aid Florida gets, where it goes, which people are able to recover more quickly, those are all product of political choices. And why should anything escape being politicized if you think it could be used for positive ends anyway? But that's exactly how you know Tucker's acting in bad faith, because if you do someone the courtesy of at least assuming that they're being truthful in their concerns, and not everyone is, you can at least understand why they are using the rhetoric they are. And then you get to be the one who can exercise understanding. And I think it's much more interesting anyway to then just dismantle their ideology rather than just call them a liar and evil and that they're beneath examination. But that's not what he does. So he goes on to own liberal media by just playing a bunch of clips of people linking Hurricane Ian to climate change.
Self-described experts are demanding that you accept responsibility for whatever natural disaster has just occurred. It's your fault, including for Hurricane Ian. So you caused it. Watch.
Decades ago, it used to be one or two a season would happen. Now with climate change and these extreme warm waters, it's almost, it's happening all the time.
This storm, in a way, is kind of bad news for the people that are still trying to deny climate change as a factor.
And that's what I'm talking about, because I guess Tucker and ostensibly most right-wing media imagine people on CNN or MSNBC to be totally cynical actors just droning on about climate change because they just see this hurricane as something they can possibly squeeze power out of. Now, I don't have many nice things to say about CNN or MSNBC, but this particular paranoia, I think, is unfounded. And it's so frustrating because mainstream liberal media fails so hard at climate change so much of the time. If you wanted to call them hypocrites or insincere or cowards, you totally could. There are legitimate reasons to do that. MSNBC's coverage of Stephen Donziger was basically non-existent. How many times have they mentioned factory farming and the manure lagoons that show up all over the country, often in black and brown neighborhoods? The very serious need to stop eating meat. Never talk about that. Pipelines, the limits right now of technology, how we need to expand public transportation. Just they so neglect all of those topics. The fact that ads for oil companies are running all day on supposedly liberal outlets. Obviously, that's never addressed either, but pointing out those things would mean embracing ideas that Fox probably doesn't believe in, we know doesn't believe in, and would risk turning off their viewers.
The number of landfalling hurricanes has dropped slightly over the past century.
So here he's going to get into how hurricanes might not be the best examples of natural disasters being exacerbated by climate change, but obviously he uses that totally cynically.
Government scientists at the NOAA and even the professional alarmists at the IPCC predict that hurricanes will become 25% less frequent throughout the 21st century.
Okay, so in the spirit of good faith, let's say that in actuality, liberal pundits and commentators sometimes wield the term climate change too liberally, and that actually hurricanes are almost exempt from climate change, let's say. Even if that were a certainty, which it's not. Most people seem to agree that even if the number of hurricanes are not increasing, their intensity is, which Tucker later makes fun of as liberals sort of moving the goalpost. But in any case, the world's leading climate scientists at the IPCC, whose research is actually still valid despite Tucker deriding them as professional alarmists, whatever they've said about hurricanes, they also have this to say. This is their best case scenario prediction for the rest of the century from their 2018 report. In 2020, strong participation and support for the Paris Agreement and its ambitious goals for reducing CO2 emissions by an almost unanimous international community led to a time frame for net zero emissions that is compatible with halting global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. There is strong participation in all major world regions at the national, state, and/or city levels. Transportation is strongly decarbonized through a shift to electric vehicles, with more cars with electric than combustion engines being sold by 2025. Several industry-sized plants for carbon capture and storage are installed and tested in the 2020s. Societal preference for healthy diets reduces meat consumption and associated greenhouse gas emissions. By 2100, global mean temperature is on average 0.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in 2018. Coastal communities struggle with increased inundation associated with rising sea levels and more frequent and intense heavy rainfall. In the tropics, in particular in megacities, there are frequent deadly heat waves whose risks are reduced by proactive adaptation. Human well-being remains overall similar to that in 2020. But that's their best case scenario, and carbon capture technology is still unrealized, and we're still selling more gas cars than electric. Certainly, you could slam liberal commentators for not going harder on these things. Their worst case scenario is where we hit 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, and it is very bleak. And all of this is and was underreported. I did a whole video about this over on my channel where it's well documented that mainstream liberal media doesn't take climate change seriously enough, despite how much they use it rhetorically, though they at least acknowledge that it's real. But obviously, and this isn't news, no one at Fox can accept climate change at all. They can't wrap their heads around it. They maybe have doubts, but they've spent too long committed to denying climate science to reverse course, or facing reality is too uncomfortable. Whatever their feelings are, the sum total is that they communicate to their viewers that connecting disasters to science and politics is tantamount to gloating that the victims got what they deserved. Reporting like this does nothing but manufacture ill will. And speaking of politics, in Washington, every Republican member of Florida's congressional delegation voted against an infrastructure bill providing billions of dollars in investments in climate-related weatherization and flood mitigation. Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis derided the $19 billion earmarked for the state. Reading that is not gloating, and no matter how big a part climate change played in this particular natural disaster, aren't things like weatherization and flood mitigation a good thing? But this is what Fox and other right-wing media specialize in, attempts to identify the cynicism and hypocrisy of liberals. That's all they know how to do. That was their angle with the migrants at Martha's Vineyard, which I covered last week. It was all about the hypocrisy of liberals who didn't instinctively rush to invite these Venezuelan migrants to stay in their homes.
So these are the very same people, by the way, who cheered as illegal aliens were removed by force from Martha's Vineyard and sent to a military base. They called them trash. They took them out within 48 hours with the army. But now they're lecturing you about compassion as they gloat over a deadly hurricane.
I didn't know that people on Martha's Vineyard were calling the migrants trash. I don't know if that's meant literally, but calling them illegal aliens and to call someone illegal would seem to be every bit as bad as calling them trash. Now, I want to play one more clip for you because I think it's an interesting insight into how Fox negatively reinforces the COVID vaccine.
How deep is their insincerity? Well, last year, during hurricane season, Joe Biden leveraged these natural disasters as a way to sell his vaccines. Watch this.
God forbid a natural disaster strikes, we have to make sure we're ready to be protected against COVID-19 as well. A vital part of preparing for hurricane season is to get vaccinated now.
Sure, the lesson of the hurricane is, and tornadoes and tidal waves and earthquakes, is to get the vaccine. Can't we just have a natural disaster that we accept as natural?
I mean, Fox can say all they want that they haven't downplayed COVID-19, but when you call it Biden's vaccine and allude to it being something that the government wants to foist upon you, ostensibly to no benefit, just as some kind of primer for further control, how is that supposed to communicate the seriousness of the virus to a Fox audience? And again, wouldn't it be more interesting if connecting a natural disaster to the spread of illness is so ridiculous, explaining why it's ridiculous? But you couldn't do that because if you did, you'd have to explain why it makes sense. And what's the point in that? So, I think I'll call it there. You can follow me on Twitter or at my own channel. Just type my name into YouTube. If you like this content, please support Status Coup's investigative and on-the-ground reporting for as low as $5 a month. StatusCoup.com/join. A small percentage of people subscribe, so if you are able to be one of those people, it would go a long way to keeping this whole thing going. I will see you next week.
You're now headed to political oblivion.
Breaking news. Reporter must be able to think clearly. This sucks.
Exactly.